This is lesson number 11 in how to write chapter 4 of your doctoral dissertation. This lesson is designed around helping you better understand about writing the introduction and conclusion sections in your chapter 4. In this lesson strategy, you'll see of the 12 lessons, we're at 11 of 12. There'll be one more lesson after this one that goes to the topic of chapter wrap-up lesson. In there, I'll give a lot of great tips to help you remember everything that was in this series of 12 lessons to help you better design your own work. In this lesson, I'll be addressing how to write the chapter introduction, as well as how to write the chapter conclusion for your chapter 4. I have 3 examples from mentees of mine who went on to graduate, so you can see how they've done their work in case you want to emulate their styles to be able to help you do even better in your own work. And then I'll conclude this lesson, as I do with every lesson, about reflective summary. Reflective summaries are important, as is reflective learning. The more you can reflect upon your learning, the deeper it's ingrained, the more you're going to remember, and the more smarter you're going to be forever. Let's get into it. How to write the chapter introduction. Give this the same focus as every other heading's content in your chapter. All too often, I've seen doctoral students, once they get the meat of their chapter 4 done, they go and they put like a quick conclusion and a quick introduction section to their chapter. I understand that you want to get done. You're excited. You want to finish your publication. You've been working on it for a long time. A lot of great people also want to see your work, but do yourself a favor. Leave enough time to make sure that the introduction and conclusion to your chapter is written well, not only in chapter 4, but every chapter. As we know, not always will people read the entire dissertation. While your dissertation chair and committee members will, it's unlikely that other people a year from now or even longer after that, when they read your work, will read your entire document from page 1 all the way to the end. So therefore, if they're only going to read chapter 4, your introduction or your conclusion may mean to them whether they read anything else in your work. So make sure you give it the same focus as every other heading's content. Be concise and to the point. As you open up this chapter with this introduction section, be concise on what you're going to write and get to the point quickly. You're only going to have a couple paragraphs, so you want to make sure that what you put in there is exactly what's needed and only what's needed. Be careful of the desire to think about putting more in there, because oftentimes more is just more. It's not better. 2 or 3 paragraphs at the most is all you need for an introduction. If you've got 4 or 5 paragraphs, that means you're probably 2.5 pages into your chapter. That's probably too much for an introduction. No data should be presented or any findings in the introduction. Just introduce the chapter and what's going to follow. Then you'll present the data in the specific sections after the introduction. I like to have the purpose statement restated in the first paragraph of chapter 4. The purpose statement helps the reader to truly understand what the purpose of the research study is. In case the research method and design is not included in your purpose statement, then make sure you also include the research method and design in this first paragraph. Also, your research questions. Your research questions may find their way into the second paragraph of the introduction, but I believe your research questions should be there, along with enough information about who was involved in your survey population. You don't have to give the entire scope of the study. You want to give some allusion to it and just help the reader understand that perhaps you sent your survey out to 800 people, maybe 360 replied, and you had maybe 340 that were usable surveys. That's more than enough information. That covers, in essence, the information about the scope of the study, how big the population, how many surveys you got back, and how many were used. Let the reader know in this introduction what are the basic major headings in your chapter. If you look back on the prior lesson where I gave information and examples from my mentees, basically gave you their table of contents, you may want to emulate that in your work and basically address the major headings that are in the chapter of your own work in the introduction section. Allude to the hypotheses testing or the themes generated in the sense that what you want to provide in chapter 4 of the introduction is to perhaps say that there were 3 null hypotheses, 2 were rejected, 1 was failed to be rejected. That's all you have to give there. Or you can just indicate that null hypothesis testing was done, and then you explain it later in the chapter. The reason I have themes generated here because you may be doing a mixed method study, and therefore you have to report both the quantitative assessment and then the qualitative assessment in the sense of presenting data. And there'll be other as appropriate or directed by your dissertation chair committee members. Because every dissertation is unique, I can't tell you exactly a prescription that you have to have. These are the major areas I believe should be in an introduction in 2 or 3 paragraphs, and I think that's more than enough. Now, some ideas for the conclusion, and in many cases, it's similar to the introduction. As with every chapter, you give an introduction, you inform the reader what's going to follow that introduction, then you give the material, then you give a conclusion, letting the reader know what was in the chapter. So ideally, we find that the introduction and conclusion are similar, though the conclusion will have less information overall, but in Chapter 4, your conclusion will give some indication what's going to follow in Chapter 5. What else to consider as you go through your own work in creating your chapter conclusion for chapter number 4 is give the same focus as every other heading's content. Remember, every heading, every paragraph, everything's important in your work, so give it your best effort. Again, be concise and to the point. Don't say exactly, like for example, cutting and pasting from your introduction, but what you're going to have is perhaps more of the salient points of the introduction, and do it in a concise manner that helps the reader understand what was the highlights of your chapter. 2 or 3 paragraphs at most. Ideally, 2 or 3 paragraphs for the introduction, 2 or 3 paragraphs for the conclusion. If I had a perfect prescription to give you, I would say have 3 paragraphs for the introduction and 2 for the conclusion. One of those paragraphs in the conclusion would be what was in the chapter, and then the second paragraph would allude to what's following the next chapter. Again, no data presented or findings in the conclusion. You may indicate what occurred, perhaps with the testing of null hypotheses, but that's about it. You don't need to put in there any kind of data or any kind of formulas. And then ensure that there's a transition to Chapter 5. Now, a couple examples to share with you from a couple of my mentees, actually 3 of my mentees. I have work here for you to see. Their work was approved on the first pass because they did a great job. They put a nice level of detail, which allowed for a nice breadth and depth to come out in their work. Each of them have provided me consent to use their work in this program. I own the copyright on this Taking the BABD program. They own the copyright for their own dissertations. And that's exactly why I give you their name, the year they graduated, and the title of their dissertation. For example, Dr. Joseph Hagee graduated in 2013. Just so happens that Dr. Hagee won the Dissertation of the Year award for a quantitative study as well at the University of Phoenix. His dissertation is titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a Quantitative Correlation Study. Here you'll see the introduction to his dissertation, Chapter 4. The purpose of this quantitative correlation study was to determine the relationships between the religion and religiosity of organizational leaders in Lebanon and their leadership practices in various industries. Chapter 4 includes an analysis of reliability and validity of the survey instruments and a description of the data collection procedures. The results of the analysis for the 4 research questions and their corresponding hypotheses are also provided in the chapter. See how in a couple easy to write, succinct, to the point sentences, he was able to communicate what's in his Chapter 4. Now, in his summary or conclusion in his dissertation, Chapter 4, he provided this. Correlation analysis was used to investigate the relationships between religiosity and leadership practices of organizational leaders. Regression analysis was performed for leadership practices on religiosity as well as various demographic variables. Statistical analysis was used to determine the reliability and validity of the survey instruments and the power of the sample size of this study. The research may be applicable to other organizational and research settings. the administration of the survey instrument, the data collection process, and statistical analysis of the data, and the results of the analysis for the 4 research questions and their corresponding hypotheses were also presented in this chapter. Chapter 4 described the research design, the data analysis, and the results of the 4 research questions and 8 hypotheses. And then he included a table. He liked the idea of putting this table for each of the research questions. There's nothing wrong with this. This does add value. It's not required, but he wanted to put it in there, and he did. And that's fine. And as you can see, basically, his dissertation has so much breadth and depth, as I indicated, that's probably why he was considered and won the Dissertation of the Year award, because he gave the table, he gave the research question, the hypothesis, he gave you the examples of what happened, and then he showed that the rejection of the null and gives the actual hypotheses. He went on to indicate regression analysis showed religion to be more significant predictor of leadership practices than religiosity. For Christian organizational leaders, a small but significant linear relationship was found between religiosity and leadership practices. In contrast, religiosity played an insignificant role in explaining the leadership practices of Muslim participants. The demographic analysis showed that gender, age, type of industry, size of organization, and number of people led did not account for any significant variance in the leadership practices for either Christian or Muslim organizational leaders. You can see Dr. Hagee gave a lot of information in his conclusion. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. The purpose of Chapter 5 is to interpret the results and reach conclusions. Findings relate to significance of the relationships between the religion and religiosity of the organizational leaders and their leadership practices in the workplace will be discussed. The contribution of the study to the body of knowledge and recommendations for future research will be covered in Chapter 5. Now, Dr. Hagee had basically 5 paragraphs in his conclusion. Of course, he called it a summary, so there's a little bit more information in it. Now, Dr. Patricia Schroeder, in 2013, in her quantitative correlation study of individualism, collectivism, and employee innovation in Turkey, provided this in her introduction to her chapter. The purpose of this quantitative correlation study was to determine the extent to which a relationship exists between cultural variables such as individualism, collectivism, and employee innovation as mediated by leadership practices in employees of organizations in Turkey. 117 participants voluntarily completed a survey that consisted of 10 demographic questions and 54 questions that measured participants' cultural orientation and perceptions of leadership and creativity. Leaders of organizations recognize that employee creativity and innovation creates a source of competitive advantage. This research study provided an understanding of specific characteristics of Turkish culture and employee perceptions of leadership practices and personal creativity, and should assist leaders in making innovative actionable in Turkish organizations. This chapter provides a review of the research process used in the study, including the research question and hypotheses that form the basis for the study, the instrumentation used, and the applicable testing of the instrument questions by a subject matter testing panel. The data analysis section presents study findings and statistical analysis of the research question and corresponding hypothesis. She concluded her chapter with a summary. Chapter 4 began with a restatement of the purpose of the research study and description of the participants who responded to the study survey. The research questions and hypotheses were reviewed, and the research process was summarized. The steps used in developing the instrument, use of the SME or subject matter expert panel, and translation process were reviewed. The data collection process was described, and a revised research map was presented. All the null hypotheses in the study were rejected. Correlational analysis using Spearman RHO presented significant relationships between the many of the study variables. The use of a one-way ANOVA and a Turkey post hoc test indicated that there were significant differences in the means between the regions in the study. Correlations and regional differences were presented and included variable descriptions to place results within a clear context. Then she went on to indicate, Chapter 5 concludes the research with a summary of the data analysis and findings. Implications for leaders of organizations and leaders of Turkish employees are addressed. The chapter is completed with leadership recommendations and considerations for future studies. You can see how Dr. Schroeder gave her introduction to the chapter and then summary or conclusion to her chapter. Now, Dr. Susan Kristiniak, in her 2011 dissertation, Exploring the Experiences of Complementary Therapy Nurses, a qualitative phenomenological study, offered this in her dissertation. The purpose of this qualitative study with phenomenological research design was to explore the experiences of the nurses practicing complementary therapies and determine if the nurses' perceived scope of care is satisfying to their professional practice. The results were intended to describe the shared practices and common meanings found in the lived experience of nurses and could assist nursing leadership in determining opportunities to promote satisfaction in the nursing profession. The Newman Systems Model proposed was a prevention-intervention concept that identified the secondary prevention intervention allowing for the introduction of increasing nurses' scope of practice with the inclusion of complementary nurses' care practices to provide a balance identified as nurse satisfaction. The humanetic phenomenological study occurred through collecting and analyzing 16 nurses who described their professional experiences. The nurses' perception interview guide was pilot tested with 5 nurses for test question reliability. All participants, 100%, who contributed data included nurses at the study site who completed education in complementary therapies and integrated these therapies into their nursing practices. The study included interviews of 16 nurses practicing complementary therapies at the single study site, and text was humanically analyzed in the Hegelian tradition of interactive and simultaneous process of an interpretive inquiry toward the goal of explaining nurses' experiences. Mataskis, in 1994, his book, noted that perceptions is the foundation of knowledge and phenomenology study. By grouping experiences, validating the information, and creating new found meanings in the experiences allows for identification of the phenomena. Now you see here she provides Chapter 4, presents the findings of the pilot and research. This chapter included research questions, pilot test of the questions, data collection procedures, demographic information, interview results, recurring themes, and chapter summary. Major themes and sub-themes were identified and grouped in order of significance. The chapter will conclude with the summary of the findings. That was her introduction to her Chapter 4. As you can see, her conclusion here is with Chapter 4 presented the findings of the study beginning with the pilot study review of the demographics and the pilot study outcomes of the 5 participants. The study demographics provide descriptions of 16 participants followed by the process used for data collection. All procedures used to analyze collected data was described that included audio-digital recording, transcription, hard copy review, and participant approval of a transcribed text before data was analyzed with in vivo 8 software. Saturation was determined following the review of 13 interviews with comparative review of additional 3 interviews. 4 major themes, each with subthemes, were presented in subsequent sections, accompanied by data text that exemplified the patterns of participants' experiences. And then she went on to conclude the chapter with information related to the next chapter. Chapter 5 will culminate this dissertation with a discussion that includes ideas and consideration that resulted from the review of research data and further benefits this study may provide for healthcare leadership. The discussion of major themes and subthemes will further explore the current and ongoing challenges in nursing satisfaction and the implications on nursing retention in this era of healthcare workforce instability, recommendations for healthcare leaders dedicated to maximizing nursing retention, and the expertise of nursing staff with direction for the future will be discussed. You can see how Dr. Kristiniak in her phenomenological study provided her introduction and conclusion to her Chapter 4. As far as the reflective summary, I gave you information about how to write the chapter introduction section of your Chapter 4, and also gave you some ideas on how to write your chapter conclusion for Chapter 4. Then I shared 3 examples. You can always replay these and look back and see how they did their work, perhaps even downloading their dissertations from ProQuestDissertations.com. And if you do and you find value in their work, I hope that you'll take the time to find them on social media and send them a note that you use their work, in essence, to help you do your own work. Imagine, should you get such an email 2 or 3 years from now as somebody else has looked at your work as an example that they emulated. I'm sure you would like to see that kind of feedback as well. In this lesson strategy for Chapter 4, I have now addressed 11 lessons. There's one lesson to go, and that'll be lesson 12 of 12, and that'll be a chapter wrap-up lesson. I look forward to talking to you in that lesson, but in the meantime, I want to ask you a question. Is your dissertation getting the best of you? And I don't mean the best of you like it's wearing you down. I mean, is it really getting the best of your skills and abilities? Are you putting in your passion? Are you taking the time to make sure that your dissertation is significant, substantial, and worthy of other people's time to read? Put your best into your dissertation and you'll get the most out of it. I'm Dr. Rich Shuttler. It certainly is my pleasure to share some information with you in this lesson about how to write the important sections of your Chapter 4, the introduction and conclusion.